Yeah, I think this concept of being a good ally, the reason why I like the way it's said like that is that it acknowledges that there's actually a role you have um, as a white person or a non-Indigenous person going into those communities wanting to offer help, and that there's like, and I guess it kind of holds this greater system at bay. There's the system of, you know, the ally as an individual who feels in her bones or in his or their bones that that there's a gap. And, you know, often when we're talking about like Indigenous issues, like there's, in a way, there's no such thing. Because while those issues might decimate an individual and an Indigenous community, and genocide is still ongoing, you know, to an Indigenous person, we would never say that there's a problem with those trees. We would say our trees are hurting. And so I think that there's this heart of the allyship, which is saying there are some significant things happening here that I'm not separate from, and I want to draw my attention to, and I don't want to ignore or deem invisible any longer. So the ally, it's like there's this beautiful reckoning in that of responding and involving yourself and listening.
This speaker series is sponsored by the following organizations: Our Secure Future, a program of One Earth Future. Our Secure Future believes that women make the crucial difference to achieving more effective governance and lasting peace. Coaching with Ginny, assisting people in rewriting their stories and transforming their lives. And Alchemy Face Bar, where they believe in connection and that good energy, clean beauty, and kindness can light up the world.
Hi, I'm Mindy Counts, and I am the founder of the Inner Ocean Empowerment Project. We are a nonprofit dedicated to healing trauma and building resilience in communities worldwide. I'm excited to introduce you today to Haaweatea Holly Bryson, the founder of Nature Knows. She is a transpersonal psychotherapist, wilderness therapist, Maori healing practitioner, relationship counselor, and a rites of passage and quest guide. Her 15-year span in the field of psychology has been across platforms such as with nonprofits, prisons, wilderness therapy programs, psychiatric hospitals, addiction centers, Indigenous communities, family adventure therapy, street side work, and in private practice. Haaweatea is passionate about the resurgence of rites of passage and has consulted and supported organizations and communities in these efforts across Australia, New Zealand, China, the US, and Hawaii since 2010. She also co-leads a global training and network in ceremony and rites of passage. Welcome, Haaweatea.
Thank you, Mindy.
So the first question I have for you, I wanted to hear more about your Maori name and its origins and how it came to be and what it means to you.
Yeah, thank you. And just before I name that, I'll just also acknowledge that I'm sitting here on Camaragal country today. So, which is the, you know, unceded land here in Sydney, Australia. And this is actually also the place where I was born. So, and my name comes from my mum's side, my mum's line, my Māori name, Haaweatea, which was my middle name. And until there was a period where, you know, I was relentlessly told that I've got to walk with it as my first name. And it was one of those names where, you know, I love that you asked the meaning, because meanings of our name always hold a lot of, you know, there's a pathway. And I think it was at a time where some of those treasures we hold a little privately, and then we're told, no, you've got to sort of wear this on the outside of your sleeve. And the interesting thing was, the year that I started speaking it publicly, I was actually back in New Zealand on a 21-day sort of hikoi or adventure with my iwi, our tribe which is South Island, New Zealand. And just from having that name, we'd come to different tribal areas and people would say, oh, you know, you're in the family of Pakanui Harper, or they would know these things. And really, really just very surprising about what names really, really mean and do. But it means to hold space and to cut to the essence. And it's with the breath, the ha, and also the white feather, which is something that my tupuna had in their hair every time they were sort of traversing the ocean.
Wow, that's so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's that piece of a name being the thing that you're always working towards, you know, that you're here to practice.
Well, and interesting that you didn't become like a car mechanic or something like that. Not that car mechanics can't be healers, but that your job is to hold space, and you work so much with other people, other humans on the healing journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that just made me laugh, because I think a mechanic that can hold space and cut to the essence might save you a lot of money when they look at your car. You know, like really, like we're also healing as being a mechanic of the body, where, you know, one of my elders says, like, we're not healers, we're tools. And so how do you kind of take in the whole and then cut to, you know, recognize the thing that's actually beneath all the other things. So I love that you use the word mechanic, because I hadn't thought about that before.
Yes. And I'm so curious with your work with other humans. And have you noticed any threads with the thing that cuts beneath, you know?
Lots of them. I think everything is in one big web and net. And that's the most beautiful thing, is the curiosity that follows the thread will find all these connections, and that it's the same in the healing work. Like whatever someone's coming in with, there is so much communication happening in their field and their whole system. And often, you know, when we're in something, we become quite narrow in our vision and in our mind, and it's that something's asking for attention, and we can actually ignore other parts of ourselves. I think that's very natural. And yet when we come back to that listening, which all we need is for someone to hold it up or remind us of it, you know, to recognize that it'll connect to other pieces. And often I find that will connect to other memories and experiences of the same thing, like that whatever we're in right now, if we really hold space for it, it is connected to other times we experienced that when we were younger. That our body remembers, and it will also connect to other family experiences. And this is regardless if you know your parents, if you're close to them, if you're adopted, but they're present there in the field. And so it's sort of this, you know, I like to feel that as a ground, that whatever you're currently in when we're present is this remarkable opportunity to heal back as well as to heal forward. And we don't always have to understand that with our mind, or to kind of, you know, drag ourselves back through those old hurts. It's like it's right there in the thread, you know, and all it needs is the acknowledgement to be also cleared with what's here and now.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And especially, you know, with our Western culture, I feel like we're so taught to be in our heads and to talk, you know, it can't heal until you talk about it, until you get all the details and figure out what happened and all these things. And so, you know, what you're presenting is that those things don't necessarily need to happen in order for the healing to happen. And
yeah, absolutely. And I'll find that often, even if we've done a lot of processing, there'll still be a piece in the body that wants to be brought back. And if we work with that level, then it also allows the processing to come naturally. It's like, you know, even when we're sitting with someone, or something's happening in a session or in a ceremony, it continues afterwards, and those pieces return. And that's because it's orienting always, the healing is always orienting around the person, not the work, you know.
Yeah. I love the visual I just got of that was really poignant. The kind of threads that tie all of our work and our ties to each other. And yeah. Now, well, so you are a Maori healer, so you have studied Indigenous healing from your ancestors, and you are also a therapist, a licensed therapist, and have studied more Western psychology as well. And do you weave these things together in your work in the world, I'm guessing? And yeah.
I have considered myself a bridge person most of my life. I think that's also been from living in different lands. I'm still currently based between Hawaii, Australia, and Aotearoa or New Zealand. And so, and then there's bridging between different, just different cultural ways and different languages. And yes, that's definitely been a part of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you talk about in your work being surrounding cultural trauma and cultural healing. Can you share a little bit with our listeners about that and what that means to you as someone who is such a bridge?
Yeah, I guess there are two different things to me. So I know we were kind of talking a little bit about cultural trauma in terms of the work of being a good ally, and I think that's actually part of being a bridge, of going into Indigenous communities or being involved. And I know that that's like one of the, one of the work that you do with your nonprofit.
Yeah.
And then the other kind of thing I'm hearing in that is around cultural healing, which and trauma and healing in general. So I'm curious which direction you're.
We can go all the directions. Well, I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is this allyship topic, because as you know, we do a lot of this work. We go into Indigenous communities and we are of service for weeks at a time every year. And we do, frequently people ask, like, how do you keep doing this work? Like, you're a white person working in Indigenous communities, and isn't that a no-no? And so we get a lot of questions about that. And so I'm curious if you could speak to that. And yeah,
I think this concept of being a good ally, the reason why I like the way it's said like that is that it acknowledges that there's actually a role you have as a white person, or a non-Indigenous person going into those communities wanting to offer help. And that there's and I guess it kind of holds this greater system at bay. There's the system of, the ally as an individual who feels in her bones or in his or their bones that that there's a gap. And, when we're talking about like Indigenous issues, like there's no such thing, because while those issues might decimate an individual and an Indigenous community, and genocide is still ongoing, to an Indigenous person, we would never say that there's a problem with those trees. We would say our trees are hurting. And so I think that there's this heart of the allyship, which is saying, there are some significant things happening here that I'm not separate from, and I want to draw my attention to, and I don't want to ignore or deem invisible any longer. So the ally, it's like there's this beautiful reckoning in that of responding and involving yourself and listening. And then I think what comes up is the way in which those two parts come together, like the way in which we enter a space or the way in which we enter a community. And there's like all these cultural differences in there. It's the same way, someone comes and knocks on the door of your house. It's like there's a protocol in communities in terms of how we enter and how we signal that we're entering and how we're welcomed and how we see one another before anything is offered or exchanged. And I think in Western culture, that's all bypassed, where there's this hierarchy of, you know, experts down to novices or victims. And so, you know, just as an example, because being based in Hawaii for the past 5 years, we had this big stand, or the Kanakamoli, the native Hawaiians, had this big stand on the mountain of protecting it from TMT bringing in more telescopes. And it was a big kind of military piece as well. And so it was, you know, it marked over, I mean, I remember the last marking was over 100 days, but it was a long time. It was, you know, over a year of camping out up there, very much similar to the Standing Rock movement. Yeah. And so there was this call, this kaya of, you know, we need you. We need, and it was very much standing in aloha, in like, it was so peaceful. And so what I found in Indigenous communities, in especially those that are dealing with like a lot of core things around trauma, not having any resources, not being given this normal resources, like here in Sydney City when I was working within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community here, it's like they often couldn't even be accepted into rehab programs. And it's like there's this big gap. There's a gap in medical, there's a gap in things. And so even though there's all these like really basic needs crisis happening, in times of mourning, in times of grief, in times of crisis, I've seen these communities, they are just immediately back together and as one body, and it's remarkable to the outside eye of how inherent and innate that healing system is in terms of a response. And so again, like up on the Mauna, where there's actually you know, a ton of resource in that community, and just so such a gift to be a part of that movement. And yet there was allies who would come up, and this was very natural, so I'm not shaming this at all, but as an example, who would just come in and they kind of whip right into the front line where the elders are and go, I'm a doctor, I'm a therapist, I'm here to offer this. And so we had to have this real system of like I think allies really need their own community of other allies where they can actually debrief and share and bridge, like understand how are we entering in, what's coming up for me, you know, and make that cultural shift. And that part of it is that there's so much happening that's unseen to the naked eye in that community already. So when you come in and you just go straight to the top, you're actually how that's experienced for the community is like you're deeming everyone else invisible. And so you're not seeing like the whole family system that's already there. And so this was you know, a big part of this kind of education around allyship. And I know that's something that, you know, you offer, and I've you know, curious about that too. And just yeah. And so and I think for us it's very much about come in as a member before you come in as an expert. And yeah, you know, and different ways of listening. And the other thing that comes up a lot for in this work of allyship is timing and pacing. You know, and having to kind of drop the own urgency, like, well, I'm only here and I have 2 hours. It's like you have to actually give up. You have to hand over those 2 hours, and you might sit and make tea, or you might be really well used in your expertise, but it's not up to you in what happens, and just that whole kind of response, and also that you're receiving as well, in being in that listening.
Yeah, that's
so I know
beautiful.
That was a bit of an outpouring for me, but yeah, there's a lot in this.
Oh, it's so good though. I mean, what I hear is this relationship of equality and reciprocity where, you know, traditionally I think that the helper complex, you know, puts this power dynamic that can be really toxic. It's very common, I'm going over there to help those people who need my help. We talk a lot in the nonprofit about the difference between fixing, helping, and serving to help kind of dissolve those power dynamics. And a lot of it is waiting and asking the question, what is needed, and can I be of service, instead of assuming what's needed. And yes, and not getting paralyzed for fear of not doing it correctly. You know what I mean? And I see that happening too.
Yeah. There's also a cultural piece around validation that I find a lot in this bridging, where Western culture is very much based on validation and based on being told you did a good job and based on it being recognized. And you don't get that, in my experience, you don't get that in these other communities. You'll get it from inclusion. You get it from experiencing the spectrum of people, from their sorrow to their humor to their directness. And that's that feeling of, oh, I'm in this family, that they're having me and I'm having them, like, because there's this breadth and depth of character that comes through. And you often are not given, and this is very much a piece around also how the difference in, I think, rites of passage in cultures too, is that in a lot of these traditional ways of child raising, we're not given that same encouragement. Of course, I come from two worlds. I come from an Australian white world and a Indigenous world. So the bridge is also existing constantly in me. Yeah.
Yes. Well, as the mother of a 10-month-old, I see the constant validation is so embedded. Good job. Look at what you did. Oh my gosh, you put that there. So good. It's really pretty wild. And before having my daughter, I was able to study a lot about Indigenous parenting and traditional ways of raising children. And that is one thing that kept coming up, was like this, constant need to say, good job, is very Western. And so I feel like, wow. And then we grow up and become adults and we're still seeking that out, and one of the reasons that one of these books I've been reading recently, called Hunt, Gather, Parent, is very interesting. She said that, giving children validation constantly, what happens is, and this was in the Inuit community, that they become competitive with each other, and then they are constantly seeking the next layer of validation. And so it makes so much sense when you look at us as adults in America. I see so much of that. We are looking for validation, and we are taught to compete with each other, which is so painful because it's so isolating, versus what you're presenting, which is to be a part of the fabric of a community, which includes not just feeling good all the time. It includes also feedback and guidance and wisdom and slowness and other things, is what I'm hearing you share. So
and that I've been so fascinated by that book. I actually haven't read it, but it's drawn my attention so many times.
It's so good. Yeah,
that's good to know. The other part is also around sharing, where in the Western world we share as a way of actually of belonging, like having a purpose, and that's very much part of our identity and part of our feeling of safety, is that I have something to share and something to give. And yet and so I think this is the other part that I was just hearing this in your words too, around the way you're welcomed in these communities, if you're coming in as an ally, is that they start to share with you. And when they share, that is like actually a really deep, that is the equivalent to affirmational validation. It's like, hey, I'm going to share something with you. And so it implies an intimacy or a trust or an opening. And so it comes from a different place. And I don't know how those two connect, but I think it's very interesting. And just what you said about the slowness that really about tracking, you know, how uncomfortable it can be for people to sometimes sit back and wait or watch or, you know, wait to be invited or to feel useless. And I think this is a big part of the trauma that we're in collectively right now, is the same as we connect to what's happening in our land, and when we connect to like climate crisis, when we connect to social justice stuff, when we connect to traumas, you know, when we're in the healing work and things come up in our own relationships, that we're in this crisis of wanting to be useful, not useless, and how hard it can be, and so using just the climate piece, you know, bigger issues as an example. The part of this work is how do we stay awake to it and stay connected to it, without feeling like we have to, you know, come in and make something better right away. And that I think this is a big part of being in the passage, you know, so in terms of rites of passage or any kind of deep transformation rather than a quick change, the heart of that, the middle phase, is that it can feel the one-time changes. So it can feel like we've been here forever, but it can also just feel like it's been a moment. So time totally changes, and so does the feeling that something's happening. And what we need to be reminded of is that something is happening, you know, and it's just that we're in the middle, this like liminal passage of it. And it's very uncomfortable to sit there sometimes, because we can't reach out and fix right away, because we would just be doing what we've always done. And so it actually takes up more, you know, it requires us sitting there in that liminal for a little bit to actually receive all the information. And that just through being present to that, something is and will happen.
Yeah, I love that. Just feeling into that and how different that is across cultures. And this identity of production, you know, as part of our value, you know, we are only valuable when we are producing or doing, actively engaged. Just to be a human being on the earth is not valuable enough. And yeah, and
that reminds me of like this topic of resilience that I know is also dear to you, that really feeling like resilience, that's an example for me of that being hijacked in our current crises or our current culture or climate. And yeah, I'm currently in Australia. We've just had a lot of natural disasters, a lot of floods, and it's touched all the community around where I am here. And but this word is being used by the government and by corporate bodies around, you know, we're resilient and be more resilient. And I'm like, oh, you've hijacked that word, because again, it's been put in this frame of, you know, building back up or being strong. And it's kind of like the same way that spiritual bypass comes in and misses a really core first piece, you know, and spiritual bypass actually makes us unavailable to the people that need us. So instead of drawing on, you know, all our spiritual world and bringing that into the physical, we kind of just like step out. And so I'm seeing resilience as the same thing, that it's like it's avoiding what's actually happening. And I've been sitting lately with the Maori word for resilience, which is manawa roa. And this is different for different iwi or different tribes of Maori in how we sit with words. But, you know, any of these old languages, and I think do you work with Chinese medicine?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and there's a lot of similarities with these Indigenous languages around the world, where when we sit with words, the sounds of words come out of the land. And, you know, we only have 13 letters in our language. And so within a word, we can break it into the different words and sounds that make it up. And it gives us a whole teaching about that thing. And so I was sort of sitting with this word lately for resilience, and just trying to remember, you know, what does this really mean? Because I think like another example is with veterans who I've worked with for over a decade, and I have been so transformed by them. And resilience gets thrown around for them too, and yet it's not something they need to work at. It's like they've already earned it. They already have it right there. And so I think that this old way of looking at resilience has been a really good reminder for me in this time.
Yeah, so you're saying resilience is something that's already pretty innate and pretty there.
Yeah, and like, so this word, should I share a little bit about this word?
Yes, please do.
And I'll just say it, even though you won't, if you're visual like me, you might want to see it, but I'll just say it first. But it's manawa roa. And so ma, that first stem, is like to be bright. It's like bright and pure. And so that's sort of that, like, part of that, the resilience is that there's a center that never gets taken from us. And there's also, in resilience, sometimes whatever we go through, it actually takes us back to our center as well. And sometimes it's very confronting, and that has its own piece, when we get stripped back. And manawa roa, manawa is, for us, it's the heart, but it's not like the physical heart. It's it's like the sacred space of the heart. And we have a few. We have one in our gut. We have one in our physical heart, and we have one up in our third eye. And so manawa is this way of being with our sensation and our feelings, and to be able to actually come through those. And it's sort of like the French word for courage, word for courage coming from that French stem of cœur, that like courage is really to be in your heart rather than in it. It's not a muscle tool that comes from the external. It's a deep internal giving over, or we kind of fall into that place. And then mana, which is, manawa roa. Actually, let me just say manawa. Wa is time and space, which is also that, like, resilience also transcends time and space, because it's something that's in us that also connects us to so many other times and places and people, that we actually have it in this intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing. Even our patterns of how we deal with things in the world, we have like non-verbal mannerisms and ways in our bodies that connect to generations above us that we might not even know the full version of. And that even our, like, what's the word, vices, come from a resilient pattern, that, like, even in our hurts, when we follow those threads, and we don't have to, go very far. It's like in the body where it'll bring them up. But that is sometimes how we're responding to something. It also connects to resilience of other generations, whether we understand that mentally or not. So that's kind of beautiful to me. And then mana is our, like, power or our authority. And I think that's also really interesting in resilience, that it's like we have to have that power returned to us. And power and authority, they're such as English words, they're so complex,
charged,
aren't they? Yeah. And even with trauma, the word power, it has such a place in trauma. And so does mana, of, like, returning parts of ourselves to ourselves. And even how that connects to what we're talking about with being a good ally, that, like, and what you were talking about with power of just recognizing, seeing people first. And then lastly, manawa roa, it's like roa is long or broad or deep. So I just think, whoa, resilience. Wow. I hadn't sat with that word, but for all that to be, of the biggest sense is, and it makes sense. And I think sitting with, people as we go through these big transformations or these big changes, and that kind of passage stage that we were talking about, like resilience is truly earned, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like it really takes all of us. It doesn't,
Yeah.
it's not like a nice little compartmentalized part of healing. It touches places that we didn't want touched, and when we come out of any kind of trauma, we can't go back to how things were, and that's another big kind of lie or illusion. And actually, it's bringing more pieces together, and so this resilience of being like, yeah, this broad, deep, whole thing that you earn through being with what you have been with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or as you were talking about with helpers and healers, also being with others.
Mm-hmm.
You know, being willing to sit in that with others too, and not shut down or yeah.
That's beautiful. Well, and you're talking about something that's not outside of yourself. You know, it's almost like the feeling that I was having as you were speaking was like a homecoming, you know, to all the parts. And yeah, I can get what you mean in thinking about resilience as like a, you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps kind of, you know, get going.
Yes.
Get on with it, right? Is that kind of how they're using it in the...
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Look forward, not back. It's like, oh, you just missed. You know, I think often that happens in healing is that I can't forget or I can't jump forward. And that can create so much shame or so much tension in us when we feel that we're being asked to do that. And we actually feel like we're being left behind, and we are. And like what happened in the trauma or the hurt is we broke away from a part of ourselves. And so it is the bringing those pieces back. And so, yeah, when someone kind of asks us to just look forward, it's like I just feel I feel the holding of my breath. It's like,
yeah. It's definitely it's the way in so many cultures around the world, you know, just keep going. And yeah.
And it's interesting too, because like a lot's coming up for me as we're just sitting with you. But I think this is another part of, because you talked about cultural healing, another part of Māori healing, which has been such a gift for me, is watching. So Atarangi Muru and Manu Korewha, two of the tohunga or elders that have really shared this work with me, and they're from North Island. And you know, there'll be times where they'll tell people like, "Come on, get off the table now," or like, there's a time to stop feeling too. And I just think it's interesting because we're talking about this, like, you know, not moving, not jumping ahead and being with, but that there's also this balance. And I think that if you take people out of this world where they need to constantly prove themselves and constantly earn their life, I think this happens immediately, which is what I find a lot in like wilderness work.
Yes.
Land work is like when we're with together and we're more human, and we have both times to feel and we have times to play and we have times to stop thinking, that's actually the balance of the healing. And so there are also times where it's like, you know, we have this release, and there'll be a point where it's like we actually need support to come out of that as well. And I think when we know we have that support to come out of that, you know, that deep cry or that terror or memory, when we know that we have support to come out, then we can actually enter in. And so that's the kind of like container. So I often think about that with like any kind of ceremony or sitting with something, is like having a container of time might be one of the greatest structures that allows us to heal a lot of things across time, because we know there's an entry and an exit, and we can kind of, therefore a lot can happen in the middle.
The cutting through, I'm remembering the meaning of your name and the getting to the essence as well. As you're talking about, okay, time to get off the table now.
Yeah, there'll be times where, you know, me or someone else is like, no, you know, it's like, get her up, carry them outside, put them under the tree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, with such big healing, that's the fracturing of the stories. You know, we can get in these loops that become over time so comfortable, you know, because they're just familiar. They're really uncomfortable once we get away from them, I think, but they can become so familiar. And so when we start to fracture a little bit, you know, then we get scared, and it's new territory and perfect time to stop thinking. Yeah, well, I'm curious, is that what you would say is, you know, the Maori healer part of you, you know, that juxtaposed with your Western training, you know, those seem like such different lenses, and yet here you are bridging these two worlds. And you've shared so much about, the energy and kind of the framework of indigenous lens of slowing down and coming home and not moving past the wounding and things like that. But I'm curious, you know, what do you see is really important about Maori healing in this time? You know, what does the Maori tradition hold that is really relevant for what's happening now in our world?
That's a good question. I'll just sit with that for a second. I mean, it's funny when we sit and be quiet for a minute and there's just like this thing right in your right in your forefront. You know, and I know you're in the work of eco-psychology a lot, and we're familiar with this great lie of separation. And we're in a time where a lot of these stories are changing. And part of the stories that are being changed is that those stories have had to be so reinforced. And but there's this sort of deeper truth that's always there. And so I think that's why a lot of I think we're in this collective liminal right now where people are feeling things in their bodies, or an underlying anxiety, or, you know, these existential kind of crises or pieces that even if their world looks okay, just kind of meets us in the background. And I think that's part of this deep transformation of a lot of these illusions or these systems that actually take a tremendous amount of effort, that are having to fall apart. And so I think that let me just feel about this.
I think one of the things you said that was really powerful is this feeling of separation that I just wanted to to name that, because I see that in my work, no matter where I am in the world, as this feeling. I talk about it like duality, but feeling so separate, and that separation creates so much pain because we are not separate. We are, and we are not, and we've forgotten that we are not separate, I think. So anyways, I just wanted to name that because that's been so alive for me in the work that I'm doing. And I heard you speak on that a little bit, but
and I think the word is sovereign. It's like the landscape and all the elements, all the systems are not separate, and we never have been, and we never could be. We can't exist alone, and we've never lived alone. And yet there is a sovereignty. And the combination of those two things is very, very powerful. And I think we separate in order to feel safe, because we don't understand what sovereignty means. And that's part of the great lie too. And so, and yet to be separate, it also has a lot to do with control. And, you know, when we are so in the external world. I think this is a big thing today when our reference point is in the external world, and the external world is constantly changing, and the internal is constantly changing, and we don't have a context for that, you know. So in the true nature of things, and in rites of passage, in, you know, all our old cultures, and this is in terms of all of us. Like, I think a big part of my work is also around this cultural identity, is that we have many, many cultures in us, and we live in a current culture too, and that is actually really young, and this is part of the intergenerational part that I think can be really powerful when we lean into it, even if we don't know, you know, we don't know it with our minds. We all have there's old stories, and it also exists for us in it exists in our movies still, and our fairy tales and our folk stories and our myths, but that we are going to go through. We have many lives in this life, and we always have, and we're going to change and transform many times. And I think until we have a culture for that, it's actually quite painful, you know, in referencing off the external and wanting the external to stay the same, or working towards something so that we finally get it. And as soon as we finally get it, it's already transformed. And so I think in families and in our relationships, and even with us, and especially with ourselves, to have this remembrance that we're actually, it's our birthright to go through change, and that it actually gets us closer to who we are, and that there isn't any rejection of different parts of ourselves. It's like sometimes we feel like, you know, when people go through a transformation, they actually have to push away who they were, but it's actually that they've just become more. And I think this is in those old stories, and sometimes we have to totally forget who we are to remember, or we go through a lot of like deaths of the self. So I think I'm coming back again to like this question you asked about this cultural lens on healing, and also like in terms of trauma, because I know that's sort of one of the core things we're sitting with here. But I think part of it is that there's that, you know, I really see trauma as a breaking away of parts of ourselves, and that can happen in the physical or the spiritual. And I think often with dissociation in a Western side, it really scares people, because there's this feeling of like self-abandonment or of disappearing. And I think, and you know, self-abandonment is one of the most painful things we do. And we do that in relationships. We do that to stay connected a lot. But in terms of trauma, what's interesting is, you know, Atarangi Muru, this Māori elder that I'm referring to, she often says it as, you know, you can never leave your body. So with trauma, like what happened, your body knows. And there's something quite grounding in that your body was there, and that we can dissociate and leave. And so there's these two realms of te ao kiko, this physical being, and there's te ao wairua, or this spiritual being. And that the spiritual being isn't, you know, I think when we don't have a culture of talking about death or dying practices, or the fact that we die many times in our life, like what we're talking about, that we can think of the spiritual world as like this final landing place, or this place that's kind of, again, separate or other than who we are. But te ao kiko, this spiritual realm, we are at work in all the time. And it is a dynamic, you know, place. And so for a lot of our dying rites, part of the preparing the person for that is that they're actually, it's like a whole journey there. It's not an ending. But yes, that this place, like we don't just have access to in our dreams or our journeying, or even our conscious moments, but it's this inherent part of who we are. And so in trauma, we can actually we can send our spirit away to, you know, sweeter pastures in a moment of need. And we can also have that happen in our physical body. And so it's like bringing these pieces back together, and that the lock for that, or there's a key that actually sits in the physical body itself, because the physical body was there, just not with the other part of ourself, which is often where our psyche, our consciousness went for safety. And so one, there's like nothing wrong with what happened. In terms of, again, resilience, like you lent on one part of your being. And then there's this, it's like trauma is only half an experience, because the other half is returning those parts of yourself. And the physical body is this amazing communicator that will actually tell us precisely and exactly where that lock is, or what wants to be restored or brought back together. And we can feel only part of ourselves, because we've also sent parts of ourselves in our spirit and our heart away. And we have to sort of bring those parts back, and you'll see like the color change in someone, or their presence in themselves. And so I think that's I think that way can be very helpful in terms of a bridge from where Western pathology might say, there's this feeling of like brokenness, or things being stolen, or I had this car accident last year, and it can be hard to come out of the victim thing of like, for me, I was hit by a car and my whole life was taken away for a period of time, and I was just lying in the darkness for months. And so we need a context for how to like become whole again. And that it's like that we have these two incredible forces at work, and our mind will never understand them. But our physical being and our spiritual being are two incredible forces at work, and both of those, like we're talking about separation, about lie, both of those are part of this incredible larger body and larger system, and are not isolated either. And we can feel really isolated in the heart of that, bringing these things back. And so healing for us is always in relationship, and that's not necessarily in relationship with like an expert who has a particular way or a particular process for us, or a particular package. And because part of it is like our healing, what is healing for us is it's held in the cells, in the memory of the body, also intergenerationally, which is why some of us are like, instead of it being like this great new thing I tried, it's like, oh, my body actually has a total attraction and a resonance with those things. And the body and the self is seeking those out. And so I think as people that can come in and listen to someone and listen to their system. And often when I'm sitting with someone, there is knowledge in them, like knowing in them, that I had no idea about, that was not mine, and I didn't bring to the session, but it's in their field, and it's in their intergenerational pieces. And I get this gift of like, wow, that's an amazing teaching. That's an amazing healing strategy that's right there. And so part of multi-healing too, which is like many old forms of healing, is that it comes out of this knowing space rather than the mind. And so we are constantly learning in our listening, and we have this sensory knowledge in terms of how we listen, where it's not just with our ears, but with sight and ways of seeing and ways of reading the body or the person. And also through our felt sense, but also our smell and our taste. That, the sensory world is constantly giving us information, if something's true or not, or right or not.
Thank you for sharing all of that. What a gift. Yeah, I feel like I really got a sense of the vastness and the beauty of this medicine that you bring, this witnessing that you bring, this space holding that you bring for other humans. And so, yeah, I could talk to you all day long. But before we were starting to close a little bit, and do you have something that you would like to offer our listeners, given everything that we've shared for the last hour or so?
Yeah, I do. I can share a sort of a worksheet of a tool around maybe connecting to these two worlds in us, and also maybe some questions around that intergenerational piece.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that just brings us to that felt sense that we didn't just like spontaneously arrive as this separate thing. I think that can be very helpful for us, and it doesn't require us knowing things mentally or having, you know, genealogical credentials or whatever they're called.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
And I also just want to say, you know, when I was saying about healing happening in relationship, that's also relationship to these two parts, these two worlds, and also, you know, the natural world. And it doesn't always have to be a person either, but just to acknowledge that.
Yeah, perfect. Well, and how, if people are interested in working with you or studying with you or somehow following along with your journey and all that you bring, how can people find you?
Yeah, so Instagram is a good place. It's at nature_knows.
Okay.
Knowing, like, not the one on your face, but knowing. And I also have been interviewing elders for some years. I'm going to start finally putting some of those interviews up there as well, because now's the time. I tend to, you know, like you, we have these beautiful conversations and then sit on them, and they're just like treasures in the box. And then other than that, there's also, I don't send mailings out very often, but sending out other kind of resources or processes. And so that's all at natureknows.co. And that also connects to our training. So we have a lot of sort of, you know, we've all been in this virtual space lately. I like to think of it as being very present in two lands at once, which is so remarkable. And we have some trainings and things on there as well, in terms of, the rites of passage and other kind of ways of knowing work on.
Perfect. Thank you so much for bringing your full self today. And I've so enjoyed our conversation, and hope we get to connect again soon in some way.
Thank you, Mindy. I'm looking forward to following what takes place in all the work around you.
Thank you.
And within you. Yeah.
All right. Much love, Haaweatea.
Much love to you, and to a big mihi to everyone that is here with us or listening with us.